Yasmin, you wrote something interesting in Time magazine that you think the pandemic and the fact that much of the world has been locked down for months has somehow given people worldwide the space to focus their attention on this issue in a new way. Am I characterizing that right?
Definitely. I think we cannot divorce this moment from the context in which it appears, which is that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic where millions of us have been forced to stay in our houses in a way that has never happened in our lifetimes. And so it's put a pause on so much, on our social lives, on economic activity, but also it has meant that we have this space to focus on things in ways that we have never had before as a collective. And we are so online, like particularly in English-speaking Western countries, so many of us are working online and socializing online. And therefore, when you see all these conversations around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's, the video of his murder being circulated, this was not something you could switch off from. There was nowhere for you to go. There was nowhere else to look. And the other thing I think is really interesting is that people had the experience of being at the mercy of a system for the first time. A lot of people, the idea of systemic racism or structural racism is nebulous. It's not super easy to understand, right? But if all of a sudden you're forced to do stuff or you're treated in a way that is not about you as an individual, but is about you as part of a collective, and actually the system is not serving you, it's failing you. Here in the UK, we've had over 50,000 deaths because of coronavirus, and that's effectively because of the failure of governance. In the US, similarly, there's been failure of governance, and people are saying, hey, this system is supposed to protect me. Is this what it feels like to be failed by a system? And then that gives people a bit of a framework to think, oh, maybe their systems are failing other people. Maybe this is what it means when people talk about different systems. There's possibility now to talk about things in a way that didn't exist before. And if I can also add one more thing, we
Yeah.
are in an era of the rise of the right wing in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, right? The rhetoric that's come from not only leaders in the United States, but in the UK and Australia and so on is unprecedented, really, for the last, 20, 30 years. And so you've got folks who have felt like they're slipping backwards, have felt like rights are being slowly taken away. And this is a moment where all of that sort of repressed frustration and disillusionment and disempowerment, I think, has coalesced into something much more powerful.
Robin Wright is a Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow and a columnist at The New Yorker, and Yasmin Abdel-Majid is a writer and broadcaster based in London. But thanks to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
As protests continue over the killing of black people by police, calls to defund police departments are gaining traction. In a historic move, Minneapolis City Council members vowed on Sunday to disband their police force and replace it with a new system of public safety. Activists have been calling for a decrease in the budgets of law enforcement for years, and now it seems as though some government officials are finally listening.
Fundamentally, what defunding means is a shift of power and resources away from punitive and harmful institutions like policing and into community-based supportive services. So really what we're talking about is cutting the astronomical amount of money that our government spend on law enforcement and giving that money to more helpful services like job training, counseling, and violence prevention programs.
That's Paige Fernandez, the policing policy advisor for the ACLU. Tanzina Vega spoke with Paige and asked her whether she thinks defunding police departments is an attainable and realistic goal.
We're not talking about defunding police, 100% across the board immediately. We're talking more about strategically reallocating resources and funding and responsibility away from police and to community-based models of safety and support and prevention. We talk a lot about the role that police play in society, but there are 10.3 million arrests made per year, and only 5% of those arrests are for what the FBI classifies as the most serious crimes. things like rape, murder, and aggravated assault. So, 95% of what police arrest people for, the bulk of their work is focused on petty behaviors that have been unnecessarily criminalized. Things like marijuana possession, unlawful assembly. In Alabama, you can get arrested and put in jail for removing a shopping cart from store premises.
I mean, I think over the past, let's say 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of focus on community reform and policing. Why not, instead of defunding, reallocate those dollars towards reforming policing?
I think that people have tried to reform, right? We've been talking for years about body cameras, training, but quite frankly, we know that is just not enough. The underlying problem with policing isn't the lack of training or community involvement or good procedures. It's the problem that they play way too big of a role in society and have far too many responsibilities and far too much power. Unfortunately, police in this country are empowered to act as an occupying force in low-income communities and communities of color, particularly Black communities. What everyone's realizing now, which is what many Black activists and advocates have been calling for years, is that reform just simply isn't enough. It is not enough. When you look at the roots of policing and where it comes from, policing is an institution built out of chattel slavery. The first police department, modern police force in this country, was in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was a slave patrol. And so it's really difficult for us to reform an institution that from its inception has been tasked with exerting social control and violence on Black and brown people.
What do you see then as a police system that would both ensure public safety and be a productive use of resources? Because I don't think it's realistic to completely defund any measure of public safety.
So I think that there is a role for police to play, but that is for the most serious crimes. And there are police who agree with this. Police have taken on way too much. There are people who have mental health crises, and police are tasked with responding to people who are in the middle of a mental health crisis, and they, quite frankly, are not trained for that, nor should that responsibility fall on them. Police have been tasked with dealing with the issue of drug use in this country, and that issue should not fall on them. So when we're thinking about defunding the police, I really want to emphasize that we're really talking about reinvesting that money into services that are better equipped to respond to society's problems. So thinking about things like violence prevention programs and putting counselors in schools instead of cops, things like job training.
I mean, I do know an NYPD officer here in New York who expressed exactly what you were suggesting, that he doesn't feel equipped to handle, people who are dealing with mental health issues, and felt really helpless in terms of engaging with that community. So I think what you're saying, and maybe hopefully I'm understanding this correctly, is to really decriminalize areas that, particularly in areas of public health, so mental health, substance abuse, and things like that, so that police can focus on actual criminality.
Well, I think there's two things here. I think the first thing is defunding and reinvesting those resources into what we're talking about, things like mobile crisis patrols, job training, counseling. But I also think we're talking about exactly what you just touched on, is that we really need to prohibit police from enforcing a range of non-serious offenses. And by reallocating those resources, we can do that. By limiting the role and scope of police, we are able to do that. Crime isn't random. Most of the time it happens when somebody can't meet their basic needs, and so they go through alternative means. Instead of focusing on what I would say is the back end, where police come in once behavior that's been criminalized or an action that's been criminalized has been committed, they come in at that point. But what we're talking about when we talk about defunding and reinvesting is really focusing on the front end. What do we do so that people don't have to engage in the behaviors that would lead them to contact with the criminal legal system?
How realistic is this right now? Do you see support for this, at least among legislators?
I think it is the most realistic it's ever been. I think this is a pivotal moment in the policing movement. And I am so glad that defunding, divestment, and reinvestment has been raised to the national level, and that national media outlets are now paying attention to it. And I do firmly believe that there are local and state and federal officials who are listening to these calls for defunding and reinvesting that money. You know, we have local city council members in New York City who are talking about divestment. We have local city council members in Philadelphia who are talking about divestment. The mayor in Los Angeles has said that he is going to cut the LAPD's budget by $100 to $150 million and reinvest that into community-based services. So I really do think we have a moment here to implement real impactful change.
Paige Fernandez is the Policing Policy Advisor for the ACLU. Thanks for being with us, Paige.
Thank you so much for having me.
We turn now to Sam Levin, the LA correspondent for The Guardian, who has been reporting on these efforts in LA and beyond. He told Tanzina that this movement may be gaining traction.
I've been talking to activists across the country, and I think all of them are saying that they're seeing interest from legislators in defunding the police in a way that they've never seen before. And in LA, where I'm based, the mayor here has proposed cutting $100 to $150 million from the budget, which is hugely significant in that he had not previously even entertained the idea of cuts. And in fact, 2 days prior had, finalized a budget that actually included a substantial increase for the police. So in terms of there being momentum around defunding police, we're certainly seeing a sea change here.
Do you think that the renewed interest in making this happen is something that you're seeing that's different? Perhaps what we're seeing in terms of the protests is that they're quite diverse, that there's a diversity of age, diversity of races. Are we seeing this idea of defunding the police really gaining traction among a larger constituency?
It certainly seems that way. There's definitely massive protests happening in these cities that are simply just larger than the kinds of protests we've seen. So they're not just these activist groups out there. There's actually just a massive movement. And I think you're also seeing a lot of protests in smaller cities, in all sorts of communities. People are talking about the victims of police violence who rarely get any national attention. And this is the moment when they're paying attention to that. So I think lawmakers are seeing that they have to respond to this in a way that's different than they previously have. That doesn't mean just talking about reforms and talking about body cameras and training. And it does mean thinking more big picture, big idea about how we respond to this moment.
Can you give us a sense of how police budgets are changing or have changed since you've been covering this?
Yeah, police budgets have always increased and expanded and are generally not under the table and not questioned in terms of their size. So during the coronavirus economic crisis, a lot of these groups have been, using this moment to say, what are our priorities, right? So cities like LA are having major budget shortfalls, expecting $1 billion drop in revenues, and having tens of thousands of city workers facing furloughs, cuts to street repairs, infrastructure, all of that. But even in the midst of that, the LAPD's budget wasn't questioned until really this week when we saw the George Floyd protests. And so you're seeing that in cities across the country.
Sam, what are the limits of defunding the police? How far are folks, do you think, really willing to go here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the next weeks and months play out. There are certainly activists who are pushing for much, much more substantial increases than what we're seeing in LA, for example. The announcement from the mayor is basically reducing the police budget from 53% of the unrestricted fund to 51% of the unrestricted fund. So it is significant in that it's never happened before, but it's not significant in the larger scope of how much we spend on police. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of questions about how this works. But I do think, activists kind of see this as a starting point to making substantial change. And they're hoping that this is just a kind of first step in reinvestment.
Sam Levin is the LA correspondent for The Guardian. Sam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
With everything going on in our nation right now, people taking to the streets to protest the deep racism in this country, and on behalf of the thousands of black men and women who have died at the hands of police, and politicians calling for military action against protesters, people are angry, people are hurting, some are exhausted. Some are finding themselves enraged over systemic racism in this country for the very first time. We asked you if you are angry in this moment and why.
Hi, this is Lori from Philadelphia. The latest publicized incidents of violence against black men has made me confront and feel the anger I suppress daily when seeing how my beautiful, handsome, intelligent, loving son has been treated by police, and how it has permanently formed his view of law enforcement and the world. I also feel anger towards those who don't even want to try and understand. I want to shake them and say, look, this is how it is. I realize that I have held my pain when these things happen and have only shared it with close friends and family lest I be considered an angry black woman. But things only change when we speak up.
My name is Jasmine. I'm from Mesquite, Texas, and I'm angry. I think that all the outrage is going to end. I'm upset that the death of Breonna Taylor didn't spark this much outrage because black women need justice too.
Hi, my name is Kimberly, and I'm calling from Olympia. My anger really comes from my inability to explain to my 9-year-old why a man was held down in public and killed simply because of the color of his skin. My son kept asking me, okay, but what did he do that makes it so bad? Why did that happen? How do you explain senselessness and ignorance to children? And how do we stop this cycle?
This is Michael Wood from Lawton, Oklahoma. I've been quite measured in expressing my thoughts, but as a retired Army officer, I'm aghast how the National Guard troops are being used by the states and what is being proposed for active duty forces. No soldier is expected to follow an unlawful order. On the civilian issues, you just don't treat people this way. Watching the clearing of Lafayette Square on Monday this week, law enforcement seems to have no throttle. An unguided missile lit at the hint of the smallest spark.
My name is Julia from Fort Townsend, Washington. I'm angry at all the people who are pushing us to return to normal, when normal is really not okay.
This is Haley from Chicago. Angry doesn't begin to cover the range of emotions I'm feeling. Frustration is probably the main one. I deal with it by getting off social media and letting myself get sucked into a forensic files binge. We have to take time to recharge so we can continue to fight for what's right. Black Lives Matter.
Hi, my name is Jessalyn, and I'm calling from Los Angeles. I just wanted to share that I am angry and I am sad, and I also feel guilty. As a white woman, I knew that there was racism in our country. I was aware of that. I even knew that it was in our city, but I don't think that I really knew. And what has been most impactful about this past week is hearing my black friends' stories and now realizing how restrained they have been in our friendship.
Hi, my name is Billy Huber. I'm calling from Omaha, Nebraska. I'm angry, perhaps more frustrated and confused. I feel like I'm taking a crash course in racism, racial justice or injustice, and white fragility, and the professors and guest lecturers keep contradicting themselves.
Matt from Maine. I've been angry for many years now. I've been scared for even longer. I'm angry because I'm tired of being scared and I don't know what to do anymore. I've been scared since the first time I had a gun pointed at me by a cop because I didn't look like somebody with my name. I've been scared since I was stopped and frisked in New York because of the color of my skin. I've been scared since I was 6 years old and saw a man brutally beaten on TV by LAPD. I've been scared every day of my life, and I'm tired of being scared and told to just calm down and relax. Now I'm scared of how angry I am. I'm angry that 65 years after Emmett Till, we lost Ahmaud Arbery, Medgar Evans, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and thousands of other human beings.